the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. 12 years ago, seems a long time. A book came out called The Israel Test, why the world's most besieged state is a beacon of freedom and hope for the world economy, by a very distinguished writer, George Gilder, best-selling writer of many technology and innovation books. It was forwarded by Joe Lieberman, distinguished Jewish American politician. The book had quite an impact. Prager University, George did a lecture which got over 1.5 million views. This idea of what he calls the Israel test suggests that how we feel about Israel, we as individuals and we as a society, reflect ourselves. It's not just about Israel, it's about something else. And he asks and continues to ask, can we pass the Israel test? The book now is out, second volume, The Israel Test, How Israel's Genius Enriches and Challenges the World. Comes with, appropriate enough, an introduction from Dennis Prager, who's in his own right a very distinguished and controversial commentator and broadcaster. And George Gilder is joining us from Connecticut. George, congratulations on the new book, or the old new book, or the new old book. What exactly is the Israel test? What does it mean?
Well, how do you respond to people who excel you in intellect, achievement, and wealth? Do you envy them? Do you resent them? Do you try to tear them down? Do you try to diminish their accomplishments? Or do you admire them and emulate them and try to learn from them? That's essentially the Israel test. And it faces the whole world. It cleaves the hearts of the world. Israel is a fabulous success as a country. It is now exceeds in per capita income Britain, France, Germany, South Korea, China. It's despite having been invaded 6 times during the last 50 years or so, it provides technology for the whole world. And particularly for the United States. Silicon Valley could hardly function without Israel. There are 100,000 Israelis in Silicon Valley, all in key jobs and engineering roles. It's just a fact of life that tests us, whether we're going to resent wealth and try to and regard it stolen from somebody else, or do we understand that the bounties provided us by the genius of Israel and the Jews around the world actually are a great source of Western civilization and Western prosperity?
George, you mentioned the Jews. And you also mentioned Israel. In your mind, is the Israel test the Jewish test? I mean, does it reflect our sense of innovation, if we like or don't like the Jews, if we admire or don't admire the Jews? Do you collapse those two things?
Yes, I do. That is a theme of the book, because it's a theme of of the Jewish contributions to Western civilization, and since the Second World War, the amazing contributions of Israel to the world economy. I mean, the agricultural productivity of the world is drastically higher, and the world population is larger because of Israel and its accomplishments, making the desert bloom.
George, you're not the first person to be making this argument. It actually brings to mind the work of Winston Churchill, who had, in some ways, I think, a similar argument to yours. Of course, he didn't live to see the maturation, if that's the right word, of the state of Israel. Do you see yourself, you keep on mentioning Western civilization, and the idea or the ideal of Western civilization is central to your book and to the Israel test. Do you see yourself in this argument as part of a tradition of defending Western civilization, as Winston Churchill was?
Yeah, well, I certainly admire Winston Churchill, and certainly this book, The Israel Test, is a celebration of Western civilization. But it's worth understanding that the predicament of Israel and the predicament of Jews is duplicated by other incredibly productive minorities in other countries. Thomas Sowell has studied the overseas Chinese, and the overseas Chinese have suffered a series of pogroms that total over the centuries as many deaths as Jews, and Thomas Sowell says that people say that the overseas Chinese are the Jews of Asia, but it might be better to say that the Jews are the overseas Chinese of the West. It's a situation where it's the key plight of capitalism, the inclination of people to believe that we live in a scarce and limited planet, and if somebody gets more wealth, it means somebody else is getting less wealth.
George, you mentioned Thomas Sowell, a distinguished conservative African-American economist and thinker. You mentioned animosity towards overseas Chinese workers, tech workers, who you group with Jews. What about African Americans? Would you include them? Is there something? Could you write a book called The African American Test?
I don't think so. I don't think that this is the situation with African Americans. We're trying. African Americans are being subjected to this victim imagery, and that is the opposite. A lot of people want to depict the Jews as victims, and I think that's the wrong way to look at it.
So the Jews so the Jews have been victimized in your view more than the African Americans, or it's
I think victimization is really not relevant.
But you could write a book called, and I don't want to focus on this, but it's interesting, The African American Test: How African American Genius Enriches and Challenges America, innovation, sports, culture, music,
Sure.
art, business as well. I mean, couldn't you say it about all minorities?
No, I don't think that. I think it is true that minorities differ and provide diverse contributions to our culture and society. But I think the Jews, who are half of the richest, or 0.02% of the world's population, and are half of the richest people in the world, and are any list, and founded most of the leading companies in the world economy, from Apple to
well, Steve Jobs
Amazon.
Steve Jobs wasn't Jewish. He was actually his adopted father was Syrian.
Yeah, that's right. But Wozniak was Jewish, and really provided. It's a typical relationship. Wozniak provided the technology that the great entrepreneur Steve Jobs propagated and popularized and made into one of the world's greatest companies.
George, well, I've been reading some of the reviews of the book, and one of them I read, and I'm quoting a review from 2011 from the original book. You're not Jewish, but the review said, in fact, no Jew could have written such a book as unabashedly positive as this one about Jews or Israel. Tell me about your relationship with the Jewish people. You grew up as an upper class East Coaster, a WASP. What is it about the Jews and George Gilder?
Well, I actually have a chapter of the Israel test. The final chapter is about my story and the story of my father, who roomed with a Jewish man, Walter Rosen, and who went to Germany in 1936 with David Rockefeller after graduating from college, and heard Hitler, and decided that he was going to have to be stopped. And my father, who was editor of the Crimson and a major Harvard figure, and went to the Council on Foreign Relations and debated the subject of the rise of Hitler in Asia. And then my father entered the war as a pilot and was lost in the beginning of the Second World War. So I hardly ever knew my father, but my godfathers were David Rockefeller and Walter Rosen.
So you're do you think of yourself as an honorary Jew? Do you get treated as an honorary Jew within the Jewish community?
No, I'm not an honorary Jew. I'm a WASP. But I honor Jews because I recognize the huge dependency of. I've spent 50 years writing about technology, and without Israel, I'm just telling you, we wouldn't have Silicon Valley. We would not have the great companies, technology companies like Google and Amazon that dominate the world lists of biggest market cap companies. That American prosperity is heavily dependent on the genius of the Jews.
George, when you meet someone for the first time, you're a technology writer, you have a remarkable network, but when you sit down with someone who you haven't met, do you wonder whether or not they're Jewish? Do we all have internally, or at least does George Gilder have internally a Jewish test for figuring out, is this person part of the Jewish people? Do you think about that when you meet someone?
Sometimes. I don't. I mean, it's not an obsession. I didn't write this book till I was in my 70s, having visited Israel and discovered just scores of amazing startups. It's Startup Nation.
There's even a book called Startup Nation, which you could have written. It was written by Dan Senor and Saul Singer. I'm sure they borrowed some of your ideas for the book. I read it years ago. I can't remember now, but I'm sure you're in it somehow. Your spirit, at least. Yeah,
they consulted me. They interviewed me when they wrote the book. I pointed out a lot of they weren't really technology experts, and so they didn't know as much about Israeli technology. But I think that the West is really now, I was involved with the Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan.
Yeah, you were close to Reagan. You were part of his administration in some ways.
And I gave Reagan his first microchip, and I told him that this technology was going to take over the world, that it would enable strategic defense, that it would enable anti-missile missile systems that could pick.
George, you have the prescience of a Jew. You see the future before anyone else.
Well, but the United States never really created SDI or effective anti-missile systems. However, Israel collaborated with the U.S. and created Iron Dome and now David Slingshot and Arrow 3. All these are anti-missile systems, and they got launched now Iron Beam, by which laser beams will be able to incinerate incoming missiles as they.
As somebody wrote about your book, which is more than metaphorical, Israel is the crucial battleground for capitalism and freedom. The battleground, of course, being both literal and metaphorical. George, some people might be watching this and thinking to themselves, if you flip George on his head, he sounds a little bit like a Nazi. You're arguing that the Jews are the origins of all that's gone well with the world in modernity, the microchip, the Silicon Valley, innovation, wealth, intelligence, and of course, the Nazis, and your father was killed in...
Religion.
Let me finish, George. The Nazis argued the reverse, that everything that was bad about the world, and you can find neo-Nazis these days in America and elsewhere, that everything bad about the world stems from the Jews. Does that ever worry you? Does that ever occur to you that you're perhaps the other side of the coin, the anti-Semitic coin?
No. I mean, I think it is true. I have a chapter on Mein Kampf in the Israel test. Has a chapter and that was one of the things that astonished me. I thought Hitler would be arguing that Jews were an inferior race or were despicable in various ways, but really he acknowledged they were better capitalists and better financiers and wealthier. And he felt that they were evading the warrior challenge, that that the world is material and scarce, and some people will get more of it, and some people will get less of this zero-sum game, and the warriors will prevail and should prevail. That was Hitler's.
So you're saying that there's some truth in Mein Kampf?
No, that's completely wrong. Because imagination and creativity in the image of our Creator provides superabundance. Abundance beyond anything we could imagine. And this whole idea that we live in a limited planet has a scarce fund.
No, I take your point, but Hitler's singling out the Jews as wealthy and powerful in Mein Kampf. You're saying that is true, or that's was true and remains true.
Yeah. That his insight that it is correct. I mean that around the world, Jews have made crucial contributions to every country that they've endowed, and it's an amazing fact that's not celebrated by Jews very much because it attracts too much attention. But the fact is that our wealth and our prosperity and opportunity is greatly dependent today on Israel.
Yeah, and had, of course, Hitler not gone to war with the Jews, literally and metaphorically, would have had a nuclear weapon, might have employed Albert Einstein.
The Manhattan Project won the Second World War for the United States. And the Manhattan Project was all Jewish. The Manhattan Project
Edward Teller, Albert Einstein. Anyway, George, what about, you mentioned some Jews don't want to stick out. They don't want to be thought of as geniuses. What about Jews who don't pass what you call the Israel test? What do you make of them? Jews who aren't Zionists. There's, as you know as well, better than I do, there has been a great debate over the last 100 years about Zionism versus socialism versus, I don't know, liberalism within the Jewish community, particularly the Jews of Eastern Europe. What about the Jews who said, we don't want a state, we don't want an Israel, and we don't even want to pass something that George Gilder calls the Israel test? What do you make of these people?
They're my political opponents. They tend to be socialists, and Israel was founded as a socialist state and almost died in 1985. In the middle of the 1980s, its inflation rate was approaching 1,000%, and the economy was about to collapse because there is a militant socialist Marxist stream among even Israelis, and I say in the Israel test, Jews are so extraordinary intellectually that they dominate the world's ranks of anti-Semites.
So the bad Jews, we've done, I'm sure you're familiar with a book called The Bad Jew. The bad Jews are really bad.
Yeah, Marx was an appalling figure.
And Trotsky.
Yep. I think that the domination of both left and right by Jewish intellect is one of the most amazing facts of Western civilization.
And what about the history of America, George? It's sort of the subtext in some ways for the Israel test. I know you're quite critical of American politicians, especially within the Democratic Party, who are very hostile to Jews and to Israel. Do you see the history of America as essentially the history of modern Judaism?
I don't think that's quite correct. I see it as but I see America thriving to the extent that it has provided freedom, which has afforded opportunities for Jews to succeed and prevail. So I think that in economic roles and financial roles and above all in my interests in technology. Certainly America's opening to the Jews in the Manhattan Project was vital to the American domination of the world for 50 years following the Second World War. And I think it's, so we have a big debt to Jewish Americans. And I'm saying, which is less recognized, we have a great debt to Israel as well. People imagine that Israel is somehow dependent on the U.S. And I believe that, during the first war in 1948, General Marshall prohibited any weapons to be given to the Israelis. And I think that the U.S. has been more dependent on Israel than Israel on the U.S.
Do you think that the Jews who came to America, particularly from the 1880s onwards, reached a kind of climax, I guess, in those 30 years before the First World War, and then again after the First World War, and obviously after the Second World War? Are the Jews, somehow the Jewish immigrants to America, more American culturally and intuitively than other immigrants into America?
I think that they appreciated liberty in the United States more than other immigrants, and they have participated, obviously, in the culture very fully, where they have congregated, such as, they moved to Los Angeles and essentially fostered Hollywood and this great American influence in the world is heavily shaped by Jewish genius. So I think wherever the Jews go, culture flourishes, and provided it's combined with freedom, provided that there is opportunity to create, and the kind of warrior rule of totalitarianism doesn't prevail. I mean, it's Jews don't do especially well in totalitarian environments.
Well, I don't think anyone does particularly well, George.
No,
your first book, the book originally came out in 2012. As I said, it came with a foreword from Joe Lieberman in October 2012. The Israel Test: Why the World's Most Besieged State is a Beacon of Freedom and Hope for the World. The book is back out now, 12 years later. How Israel's Genius Enriches and Challenges the World. It's obviously particularly polemical. I want to talk about contemporary Israel in a couple of minutes. But a great deal's changed in America between 2012 and 2024. We had, of course, the Charlottesville riots, where young men seem to be walking around with Nazi insignia and flags. We had January 6th, which some people see as also a form of anti-Semitism. What's happened in America?
Why was how was January 6th anti-Semitic? I can't remember.
Well, some Jews, I think, might interpret young men running around with Confederate flags as being, if not assault directly on Jews themselves, certainly on minorities. But anyway, that's another subject. What's happened in America, George, in your view, over the last 12 years? Has it become less tolerant, and particularly towards the Jews? There have been all sorts of outrages, bombings of synagogues, more and more openly anti-Semitic groups on the internet in particular. What's happened here?
Well, I think there has been a collapse of the culture, and this collapse, which I wrote, one of my first book I wrote was called Sexual Suicide. Way back.
That sounds a lot of fun.
Yeah, and it really predicted. It's the current edition of that also has come out this year. It's called Men and Marriage, and it explains.
Sexual Suicide came out in 1973, George. That was a long time ago. You're a prolific writer. You also wrote Life After Television, which I always found brilliant. Telecosm, Life After Capitalism, Life After Google, all sorts of post lives. But back to America. Life After America, perhaps.
Well, I hope so.
So what's happened? Is it that these people have come out of the woodwork? Is it some sort of
well, I think our there's been a collapse of families and culture and belief in God, and so the creativity and the image of our Creator is flagging in the United States to some degree, although it does continue. And I believe that we're on the verge of a great new technological revolution that will be as
right? And
enriching.
yeah, no, I take your point. And obviously evangelical Christians are particularly sympathetic to Israel. They would pass your Israel test. But many Jews, I don't know how it breaks down, but many Jews are actually rather secular, George. And of course, Israel was, as you suggested, founded on secular principles. So do you think that Jews, both in and out of Israel, should be more religious? Is there a crisis for Western Judaism?
I think there is some crisis of Western Judaism, yes.
So they should go to synagogue more? Is that the problem?
Well, I don't know that they could uphold John. I have a chapter in the Israel test about John von Neumann.
And, who's really the father of the digital revolution?
Yep, the father of the digital revolution, the father of the quantum revolution, the father. He ended his life, and also a key figure in the Manhattan Project, and a key figure in the decision of the Israelis to acquire nuclear weapons back in, and a key figure in the Weizmann Institute purchasing a computer, one of the first mainframe computers. So
did he go to synagogue?
He ended up as a Catholic.
Dear.
He was, but
what does that tell us about whether Jews should go to synagogue more or less?
I think that Jewish monotheism is critical to a belief in a meaningful universe where human actions have significance and moral character. I think that and that imagination and creativity and the image of our Creator is the role of the human race, and Jews have been leaders in expounding that role. And to the extent that they really abandon it, they can too fail their Israel test.
George, you're not a geopolitical thinker. The Israel test isn't really about contemporary Israel, certainly Israel in 2024. But it's obviously, I don't need me to tell you this, enormously controversial. People estimate now 40,000 dead Palestinians in Gaza. Is there anything that, and I'm guessing you're sympathetic to Israel still, very loyal, in fact. Is there anything that Israel could do that would morally outrage you? I mean, if, for example, and there are some people on the Israeli right who would like to do this, if they herded Palestinians into camps and shipped them out, or perhaps even murdered them, would that horrify you?
Sure. It's not. That is not what's happening. Israel has been attacked 6 times. The Palestinians have in their law that the pensions of Palestinians get increased in proportion to the number of Jews they kill. This is a movement which the UN has fostered and the US has funded, that has the abolition of Israel as its key goal, and Palestinians could end the war at any moment by just surrendering. They have to surrender. They can't uphold their delusion that their fanatical delusion that they can destroy Israel because somehow Israel's land is theirs. The land was before the Jews, the latest immigrations of Jews to Israel. There are only about 200,000 Arabs in Palestine, between 200 and 300,000 Arabs, and they had an average lifespan of 35 years. It's Israel had, now there are 5.5 million Arabs in the Palestine territory, and their lifespans are close to over 70 years.
So they should be thankful, you're saying?
They certainly should be. They should be. And they came to, they wouldn't be there if the Israelis hadn't made the desert bloom. You know, when you talk about a two-state solution, Jordan is the same essential geology as Israel is, but it's 4 times bigger and has a 10th the population density. And it's a Palestinian state. And it's just that the Palestinians have become so fanatical and so obsessed with the destruction of the most prosperous and important country in the Middle East that they no longer can function. So the Arabs won't have them.
George, finally, who knows what's going to happen over the next few weeks, but some people fear a broader Middle Eastern war. Hezbollah, Iran, Israel, perhaps even the United States. There's an apocalyptic quality to all this. Could almost have come out of the Old Testament. Do you, in the way you're talking, I'm not suggesting you relish this war, but are you suggesting that? Hold on, let me finish the question, George. In your sort of Western civilization versus the rest of the world kind of narrative, is this final confrontation kind of ultimately inevitable in your view?
No, I mean I think it's not inevitable, and it probably won't. It's not going to happen. Israel is much more powerful than most people estimate. They got more military capabilities, and I think they will succeed in surmounting this crisis. Under Trump, they negotiated the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia and a bunch of other Arab nations. Israel will be, I think, will emerge more powerful and more influential from this crisis.
Well, George Gilder, it's always an honor. You're one of America's most distinguished writers, controversial, not shy to express your opinion. Finally, how did I do on the Israel test? Did I pass? Did I fail?
I think you're a great interviewer.
That's avoiding the question, George. Did I pass it or not?
I don't think you were about passing the Israel test. You were about challenging my thesis and having a lively. I don't know what your views are on the Israel test. You're promoting the book, so I presume you pass it.
Can I step on the sea?